Well, welcome to our class on the Apocalypse. Today is episode number 24. We're on chapter 21 in the manual. Last week we discussed Abraham, the immigrant, spelled with an E, as he left the city of Ur and the land of Ur. Today we're going to be talking about Abraham, the immigrant, with an I, as he now departs Haran for the land of promise. Genesis 12:1. Now the Lord said to Abraham, "Depart out of the land, out of your kindred, and out of your father's house, into the land that I will show you." So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him, and Abraham was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. You see, there is a difference between leaving and coming, between leaving and going. The prodigal left, but he had a home to go home to. He left when he went home. Abraham's leaving was not simply a matter of geography. It was not a matter of moving from one city to another, or even of moving out of a city to a rural area. A change in geography may be helpful and even necessary for one to free themselves from the city, the box that imprisons them. Abraham's immigration was one of soul rather than body. Literally, of course, he followed a free and unfettered impulse and departed with all speed, first from Chaldea, the land at that time blessed by fortune and at the height of its prosperity, and he migrated to Haran. Chaldea, a later name for the eastern end of Mesopotamia, was the birthplace of civilization, including the birthplace of cities, governments, writing, mathematics, astronomical science, poetry, literature, and architecture. All of the things we think about with civilization were created, were born, came out of Mesopotamia. The academic, intellectual, political, social, and cultural box was created in Chaldea. Chaldea is the birthplace of the city. The Chaldeans were especially active in the elaboration of astronomy. There, if you have the printed text, you see astronomy written in the Greek, as I'm quoting from Philo, and I want you to see the use of these terms in the original context, from which the calendar came, astronomy, which told farmers when to plant, and upon which a sustained food supply all cities depend. It is astronomy that is the foundational science upon which humanity survives, because it created the calendar from looking at the stars, and it is because of the calendar the farmers know when to plant, that the domestication of crops took place, which allowed the further domestication of animals to take place, which began to guarantee a food supply and a sedentary lifestyle of staying in place while the crops grew, rather than just being nomads following the sheep, the goats, and the cattle around and dwelling in tents. The heavens, the skies, dictated when to plant, while the moon gave us the months, and the suns and the years. Astronomy and astrology ascribed everything to the movements of the stars. Well, the ancient astronomers, the ancients noticed a correlation between the position of the stars and the seasons of the year. They connected the stars together in their minds to create pictures called constellations, and they noticed how these constellations moved in the night sky. For example, it was easy to spot Orion and to notice whether he was standing upright or beginning to lean, beginning to fall down, or whether he was, in fact, flat on his face. These ancient astronomers learned how to count, and they needed a method of writing to keep a record of their observations. They also had to transmit their technical skill of reading, writing, and arithmetic to their apprentices, and so they also invented education. They invented reading, writing, and arithmetic, and how to teach that to their apprentices. Because the astronomers predicted when to plant, they joined within themselves the function of priest and scientist. It is as if by magic, when they said when to plant, and then simultaneously they led the fertility rites to pray for a fertile and productive harvest. The two functions of priesthood and scientist merged together. The memory of the relationship of the stars with the seasons and the seasons with planting and harvesting, and the creation of a calendar with its days and years is easily seen in the following passage from the Old Testament. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs, for seasons, and for days, and for years. And while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease." All of those things, natural phenomenon that go into the creation of the calendar. The relationship of the role and the function of the astronomer priest, the relationship of the stars regulating and ordering, giving order to our lives and to seasons and days and years, into seed time and harvest, led to the same stars regulating our personal behavior. The celestial calendar of the stars told us when to plow and when to plant. The domestication of crops led to the domestication of mankind. Scientific thinking, calculating the stars, changed how we lived, changed us socially. No longer nomads, we built permanent houses, barns, and storehouses. An abundance of food led to the creation of communities that grew into cities with a population no longer needed for food production, who became the poets, authors, painters, and musicians, artists, as well as the priest, the scientists, and the educators, astronomers, and the from politicians, the city officials. The freedom of the nomad gave way to the regulated security of the stars and its astronomical calendar. Life now was externally regulated and determined. We couldn't go do what we wanted. It's time to plow. We can't go do what we wanted. It's time to plant. We can't go do what we wanted. It's now time to harvest. You get the picture. We are now tied to a schedule and to a location rather than following our animals around nomadically. The stars controlled our lives. Astronomy becomes astrology. The astronomer priest told us when to plant. The astronomer priest also regulated the daily and seasonal activities of our lives. Schedules and rules now determine the lives of those living in cities. The astronomer became our astrologer, telling us when and whom to marry, when to travel or not to travel, when to venture forth and when to retreat. Mankind's life was now lived inside a box, the city. We looked at this in depth in our last seminar. The science of astronomy became the scientism of astrology. The world of the city became its own primal deity, primal God, and replaced the work of the primal God and Father of all, who, though invisible, yet brings all things to light, revealing the natures of great and small. By whatever name it goes, astronomy and astrology are opposite sides of the city coin. It was the astrologer, I'm quoting Philo, it was the astrologer and the meteorologist who took care of the Chaldean tenets, beliefs, as a father would of his children. The birth, continued existence, and life within the city was dictated and controlled by the stars. That is, their lives were controlled by those who calculated and those who declared the implication of the scientific calculations. They suppose, the Chaldeans did, that the course of the phenomena of the world is guided by influences contained in numbers and numerical proportions or mathematical calculations. Okay, notice this. This is the point. Thus they glorified visible existence, things they could see, leaving out of consideration the intelligible, that's that cognitive awareness we spoke of the invisible. In terms of the 9-dot box that we looked at last time together, they focused only on the visible dots, the stars, and they left out the knowable, cognitively awareness of the invisible spaces inside and outside the dots. While exploring numerical order as applied to the revolution of the sun, moon, and other planets and fixed stars, and the changes of the yearly seasons, and the interdependence of phenomena in heaven and on earth, the stars controlling phenomena on earth, they, the scientists, concluded that the world itself was God. They made the visible and the empirical, that which had been created, into their gods. They worshiped the sun, the moon, and the stars, the visible creators of their calendar, their food, and their city. They worshiped and deified their physical and empirical world. This was their box, their city, and there was nothing outside the box, outside their city. This was Abraham's world, his city, and in this box and creed, Abraham had been reared and for a long time had lived and remained a Chaldean. Then opening the soul's eye as though after profound sleep and beginning to see the pure beam instead of the deep darkness of sleep, he followed that ray, that beam of light, and discerned what he had not seen, not beheld before. Abraham knew without knowing how he knew. He was cognitively aware that reality, the universe, was not limited to the visible travelers across the sky, the rangers of heaven, or to the science of Chaldea. He knew, Abraham, again, without knowing how he knew, he needed to depart from the greatest of the cities, this world. For by doing so, he would be better able to apprehend, become cognitively aware of the overseer of all, of everything. Abraham left the city of Ur, left its empirical box, left the science and scientific way of thinking of Chaldea, Abraham acted upon the vision, upon the insight, upon that ray of illumination and understanding the need to depart. He obeyed the vision. He acted upon what he now knew. He hastened to obey, not as though he were leaving home for a strange land, but rather as a returning from amid strangers to his home, a home like he had never known before. He did not denounce or renounce the physical world. He departed from its absolute empirical claim. Abraham did not renounce science. He abandoned scientism and its claim that nothing existed outside its empirical box. That's a huge distinction. He stepped outside the box. He stepped outside that rationalism that had rationalism only into a life that had two ways of knowing. One way, that cognitive awareness of the invisible as well as the spaces between the visible as one way, and also the rational way of thinking about stuff that one now cognitively recognized. Abraham stepped outside the empirical box. He did not step outside an empirical world. The world he stepped into still had empirical dots, but it also had the non-empirical way of knowing, of cognitive awareness of that which was also invisibly, non-empirically present. Abraham left Chaldea and he immigrated to Haran. And from the distance of Haran, now there, Abraham began to understand the revelation of the unseen voice he had heard. Inside every one of us is an invisible mind, our invisible mind, that makes use of our physical bodies, our mind makes use of our sense of touch, taste, smell, eyesight. Our invisible mind makes use of our five senses in order to make use of an empirical world. What use, we might ask ourselves, would our sense organs be if our invisible mind was not inside of us to make use, to control, to guide our use of our five senses? What use is sight if there's no mind to make use of the sight? The creation of astronomy, the difference. Notice this. You wonder, what are we talking about? I want to talk about today in 2021. Here's what we're talking about. The birth of civilization came from astronomy and calculating the seasons of the year and planting and harvesting. It is from astronomy that humanity became farmers and created cities. The difference between astronomy 6,000 or 8,000 years ago in Chaldea, in Mesopotamia, and today is simply a matter of technology. They did not have a telescope. They did not have a computer. They did not have all of the technology available to astronomy and science today. But if you give an astronomer 8,000 years ago today's technology, there would be no difference in their function. We have the technology that makes possible for a Chaldean to now go to the moon. We have the technology for a Chaldean to put a robot on Mars and have a helicopter lift off of it. We are just modern day Chaldeans. Yeah, if we can see that. So what we're talking about with the Chaldeans and what Philo is talking about with Abraham and the Chaldeans is about us. He's talking about us. When we leave the city, the box, and step outside this box we have imposed upon ourselves, when we step outside the box that keeps us from connecting the dots of our own lives, that keeps us from knowing who we are and what the meaning of life is, when we step outside the box, we discover who we are. We are so much more than a physical, visible body. We are so much more than a walking collection of 5 sense organs. We are more than physical dots, and there is more to life than a physical world. It is when we step outside the box and leave the city that we come to our senses. That's almost a pun, isn't it? When we step outside our 5 senses, we finally come to our senses. We have now arrived in Haran. In Haran, we know ourselves to be so much more than just physical. Those in Haran, at the very least, know for certain that the world, this physical world, is not the primal God. It is not pre-existing and eternal in itself, but a work of the primal God and Father of all, who, though invisible, yet brings all things to light, revealing the nature of all things great and small. If we are more than a physical body, then just perhaps reality is also more than a physical universe. If we have an invisible mind, maybe there is an invisible mind, an invisible presence overseeing the universe after all. Well, it is easier to leave than it is to depart. What? Not everyone who lives in Haran, who knows there is more to life than the physical, and who knows there must be a God or a something more than only the physical. Not everyone in Haran that knows that, not everyone departs from Haran to find that God or that something. So you see, there are many who live in Haran, who remain in Haran, worshiping the unknown. And there are many unknown gods worshipped in Haran throughout history. Their names and images are scattered throughout human history. By remaining in Haran, living in a physical world and knowing there's got to be something else, Haranians mistakenly make their deity, that something, the empty box, the dot in the center of the box. You see, we dealt with it last week, and I'll deal it quickly. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And however you configure it, we get the box. And an Haranian is going to come and say, aha, I may not have connected that dot to anything, but I believe there is still that dot. What an Iranian does not know, those of us who say, well, I believe there's something, we live in a box, this physical world, and we hope there is that dot. So we believe there is a dot. We just don't bother to go find that dot. By remaining in Haran, Haranians mistakenly make the center dot their deity, as I just said. But they end up still living trapped in their physical box to begin with. It's still the cube in Paris. It's still that modern symbol of 20th, 21st century humanity, the physical world without the dot, no matter how much someone in Haran says, yeah, but I believe it's there anyway. So many people find it easy to leave an uncomfortable situation and to get out of where they are in order to find a less threatening place. I may feel threatened in Ur because you cannot even privately say, well, I kind of think there's that dot. And so we take refuge in Haran, still living in a box, only we're not persecuted for having a question mark that there may be something out there. The second migration, the first migration from Haran and its box, from Ur and its box to Haran, knowing there's got to be something. That's the first migration. The second migration is not as before, from polis to polis, from city to city, but it is, as it were, into a desert country in which to wander, never complaining of the wandering or the insecurity which is caused by being in the unknown and unfamiliar territory. I assure you, for anybody that was not reared inside the Orthodox faith, those who have approached the Orthodox faith, and those who have finally embraced the Orthodox faith, know well what it means and what it feels like to leave everything you thought you knew behind and began to wander in the unknown, insecure world of this Orthodox wilderness you now find yourself in. The journey from Ur to Haran is a change of geography, exchanging one pattern of connecting the dots for another. But it is not a categorical change. For example, within westernized thinking, it is rather easy to change one's place of worship from one denomination to another. The change is within the box of Westernism. The change from Protestantism to Catholicism, or from Catholicism to Protestantism, is like the journey from Ur to Haran. It's a much bigger change, more radical change, but it's still a change within Western thinking. Even the change from being a believer to being an atheist is a change within the Western box. You're still part of thinking like the rest of the world, Western world. The journey from Ur to Haran only changes geography. The configuration of the dots within the box is a square, or it is an X, or it is this kind of X. You change the configuration, you've still got a box inside the 9 dots. There is a difference between change within the box and the categorical change of stepping and living outside the box itself. There is a categorical difference between living in a polis, a city, and a desert. To depart Haran, that is, to depart out of the box, is like being not only severed from one's own country, but to be driven out of all city life into an unknown way of living with pathless tracks where travelers can hardly or barely find their way. And now the Lord said to Abram, "Get out of your country, from your family and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you." Then Abram took Sarai his wife and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan, So they came to the land of Canaan. Abraham passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh, and the Canaanites were then in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land of wandering. And there Abraham built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. Abraham had found himself in Haran, but he did not find the invisible one in Haran. Abraham knew the difference in knowing there is an unknown and knowing the God who is. Abraham did not remain in Haran. Having immigrated with an E and left the Chaldean city of Ur, Abraham now immigrated with an I and headed towards the invisible one who called him. He departed Haran and headed towards a new home, not as though he were leaving home for a strange land, but rather as returning from amid strangers to his own home. Like a prodigal, he now hurried toward home. Let us not underestimate Abraham's departing. It would have been easy for Abraham to have changed his course, direction, and he could have hurried back to Haran, or he could have hurried all the way back to Ur, paying little regard to his future hopes, but eager to escape that uncomfortableness of the unknown, present hardships, thinking it folly to choose uncertainty for the evil he already had. At least he was comfortable knowing the evil he already had. As easy as it would have been not to have gone on, Abraham cast those doubting thoughts aside. He chose an unknown life with God, an unknown life with an unknown God instead. He yearned to follow this God. He hastened to be obedient to the call of God upon his life. Abraham left where he was to get where he was going. So what is meant by land? One can change their geography without changing how they live. You can take the boy out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the boy. God leads us to a land which is different from where we came. God leads us from the present realities of country, family, and house, to a land that I will show you. God leads us from the literal, which is familiar, to higher realities. The land to which He leads us is none other than where God is. Did not Jacob, using a rock for a pillow, go to sleep in a field And in a dream did not God tell him in a dream not to fear the land in which he dreamed? Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, "The Lord is in this place, and I didn't know it." Suddenly, Jacob was afraid. He had been wrong. He thought God only dwelt in a literal house in a temple. And here Jacob was in the middle of a field, in the middle of a dream, and this field and this dream was none other than the house of God. The house of God is not this that is all around me, consisting of things at which we can point or that fall under the sense perception, generally speaking. No, the empirical world in and of itself is not God's house, but that which is invisibly present within the visible world, withdrawn from sight and apprehended only by that cognitive awareness, only by the soul as soul. Who then can that house be? Who can be this invisible house present among us? Who could it be but the Word that is antecedent to all that is to come into existence? The Word, the creator of the universe and the fabric of his handiwork, is without approach. This is the land that God said, "I will show you." Well, that's an awfully good point to take a break. So why don't we take a brief break now before we come back in a little bit, and we'll continue on our journey with Abraham in this land where God is. We'll be right back. Thanks. Well, welcome back. I'm going to move the heading for those of you that have your manual a few pages over. You have the heading Science Becomes Scientism, and that break is now. So this is our topic, Science Becomes Scientism, only we're starting where we left off. Among ancient scientists of Mesopotamia who invented mathematics, algebra, astronomy, and whose astronomical diaries are the longest continuous record of astronomical observations covering over 600 years. By the 1st century A.D., the Chaldeans have the reputation of having, in a degree quite beyond that of other peoples, elaborated astronomy and the casting of nativities. They have set up a harmony by the 1st century between things on earth and things on high, between heavenly things and earthly. That is, the Chaldeans had established a harmony between the behavior of the stars and the behavior of people. A harmony between the movement of the stars and geological behavior of the earth. According to a 1st century account, these ancient scientists, following as it were the laws of musical proportion, have exhibited the universe as a perfect concord or symphony produced by sympathetic affinity between its parts, separated indeed in space, but housemates in kinship. In other words, in the ancient world, there came into existence a symbiotic relationship between science and human behavior shaped by science. In the ancient world, this symbiotic relationship, this housemates in kinship, was quite visible and openly acknowledged as the terms astronomy and astrology suggest. Today, this symbiotic relationship is acknowledged in the terms science and social sciences. The acquiescence and acceptance by a people to live in the same house in which science dwells creates their mutual identity. It creates their kinship. This kinship between the house of science and the social behavior is seen also in the terms science and scientism. They are two separate realities, but the kinship between the two is visibly known the way astronomy and its kinship with astrology was also known. Science becomes scientism when anyone accepts that science's understanding of the universe is true, that the universe is only empirical. Acceptance and believing are the same when one lives their life according to what they accept or believe to be true. On a practical level, we believe personally science when we plant our garden according to the calendar. However, every farmer and gardener know from their own personal experience what the truth is of when to plant for their particular location. In Waco, Texas, you might plant your garden on Valentine's Day, while here in Oklahoma City, you might need to wait to plant your garden till St. Patrick's Day, the early plantings. It depends on your location. Every farmer, every gardener knows the lay of their own land, its elevation, and so forth. Everyone knows what the truth is to plant their own garden on their own patch. Scientific truth becomes relative to their own lives and their own location. On a community-wide level, the acceptance and belief in truth, the truth of a mathematical calculation of science, are used to shape and control human behavior. One only need to consider the application of Darwin's scientific theories on evolution to the creation of an American eugenics movement and its fulfillment in the Nazi Holocaust for an extreme modern example of what society can do when it applies science to human behavior. That doesn't make science guilty. It shows the tendency for the scientist to become the priest being the dictator of the behavior of the community. Now let us be perfectly clear. We are not speaking from the perspective of faith versus science. Please, we are not commenting on that. Instead, we are today and have been in this seminar discussing the relationship between the science of a community and the behavior of the community. Between the science and the behavior of the community. That is, how does science understand itself, and how does the community understand science and what science does? In what way do people use science in the popular mind to structure or restructure society in order to control behavior in that society? In John's, the mystagogic gospel, we discuss Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which has been hailed as a landmark in intellectual history and was named by the Times Literary Supplement as one of the 100 most influential books since the Second World War. It was Kuhn who used the term paradigm for the structure or framework within which separate sciences does its thinking. It was Kuhn who created the term paradigm shift to describe the abandonment of one paradigm and the endorsement of a new paradigm within which to do its thinking. Kuhn says that to be accepted as a paradigm, a theory must seem better than its competitors, but it need not, and in fact never does, explain all the facts with which it can be confronted. Many of us have been known to act without thinking, and for those who think before they act, will think about things, but almost none of us has ever thought about thinking. What is thinking? How do we know what we think we know? You see, we seldom, if ever, think about the structure, the presuppositions, and the basic assumptions we take for granted that create the framework, the paradigm within which we do our own thinking. Likewise, the scientists seldom, if ever, think about the paradigm within which they do their thinking, much less ever step outside their own paradigm. Instead, scientists who think about a portion, a segment of the physical, empirical world, who use a specific paradigm with which they think about their segment and portion of the world, in turn use that same paradigm to see and to think about the whole totality of reality. They use the paradigm for the portion to then think about the whole. Or better stated, they assume nothing exists outside the assumptions they use in their own paradigm, that nothing exists outside the empirical world. If I do my scientific thinking about a physical portion, that nothing outside the physical exists as I do my science, I then take that same limited paradigm when I suddenly am asked to think about the existence of existence. I can't think outside my paradigm. Well, there's nothing outside of physical existence. You see, the glasses they put on to do their scientific work remain the same glasses they use to view everything else. Or there is no everything else, because nothing else can exist according to the assumptions of their limited paradigm for their limited portion of reality. Science becomes scientism when anyone, whether a scientist or not, imagines that this visible universe is the only thing in existence, either being itself God or containing God within itself as a soul of the whole. They make fate and necessity divine, thus filling human life with much impiety by teaching that apart from the phenomena, the visible that we see, apart from the visible, there is no originating cause of anything whatever, but that the circuits of sun and moon and the other heavenly bodies determine for every being in existence both good things and their opposites. Now, that sounds like something a right-wing evangelical Protestant fundamentalist or radical conservative might say, doesn't it? Those words I just quoted were not written by someone in the 21st century. They were written by a first century Hellenistic Jewish scholar living in the large cosmopolitan city of Alexandria in Egypt. These words were most likely written around 40 AD, which would be between the time of the crucifixion of Jesus in 30 AD and the time St. Paul wrote his letters. These words from Alexandria were written well before any of the Christian Gospels came to be. In another place, Philo comments on scientists of the physical applying their paradigm to the non-physical. That is, he speaks of, quote, those who extend the activities of their word cleverness to heaven itself, men who gave themselves to the studies directed toward nature, or rather against their own soul. They, these scientists, declared that nothing exists beyond this world of our sight and senses, that it neither was created nor will perish, but is uncreated, imperishable, without guardian, helmsman, or protector. First century Judaism, Hellenistic, cosmopolitan scholar talking about the role of science, taking its paradigm from doing its own work and imposing that limited paradigm upon existence as a whole. By no stretch of the imagination was Philo a right-wing, anti-science fanatic. He was a leading Jewish figure, widely known within first century AD Judaism. According to Josephus, Philo headed a Jewish delegation that met with the Roman Emperor Caligula. Philo was a Jewish theologian, philosopher, and scholar. He was well educated and cosmopolitan. The issue for Philo in the first century and for us in the 21st century is not faith versus science. It is the nature of existence itself. Is reality created or uncreated? That is the divisive issue. Neither side can prove its case. Neither side can convince the other. As German theoretical quantum physicist Max Planck said, a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it, the new. Welcome to the 21st century. An old generation is dying, and a new generation that has never been taught the old paradigm is now in charge. In these matters, neither proof nor error is an issue. The transfer of allegiance from paradigm to paradigm is a conversion experience that cannot be forced. Still quoting Kuhn. Is reality created or uncreated? Practicing in two different worlds, two groups, see different things when they look from the same point in the same direction. Again, that is not to say they can see anything they please. Both are looking at the world, and what they look at has not changed, but in some areas they see different things. And they see them in different relations with one another. That is why something that cannot be demonstrated to one group may be intuitively obvious to the other. It is why before they can hope these two groups to communicate fully, one group or the other must experience the conversion we have been calling a paradigm shift. He's talking about one scientific paradigm shifting to another. We're applying that to the larger issue of one group saying existence is created, and a newer group, according to Philo, an older group, likewise saying existence is eternal. This is a scientist we're quoting, speaking about conversion as a transfer of belief from one paradigm to another. Kuhn's comments about belief and conversion bring us strikingly close to Nietzsche's predictive vision that science itself also rests on a faith that truth exists, a belief that what science says is the truth. Now, those of you that are wondering, when are we going to get back to the Bible? Let us remember that Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Truth. Before Pilate, Jesus is confronted, and Pilate will say to him, what is truth? This is the heart of the matter. What is truth? Who is truth? And this is the issue of Armageddon. This is the apocalyptic issue that every era, every eon faces. The truth by which we live and the truth by which we die. If it were not from the belief that truth exists, from where would science be permitted to take its unconditional faith or conviction on which it rests, that truth is more important than any other thing, including every other conviction or faith? I'm quoting Friedrich Nietzsche, himself a scientist. Thus, Nietzsche says, the faith in science, which after all exists undeniably, exists on its belief in truth and in the assertion that its truth, scientific truth, that it's only an empirical universe, is true. The belief that the truth of science is true. That's scientism, a beliefism. Believing the truth of science is true versus believing a different truth about creation is true. Both are belief systems. The self-proclaimed mantras, I'm quoting Nietzsche the scientist, of having the will to truth. Science has the will to go for the truth, and we want truth at any price, is proved, in fact, in history to be a dangerous slogan to have after the fact. At any price, how well we understand these words once we have offered and slaughtered one belief system after another on the altar of truth. The will to truth and truth at any price ultimately means I will not deceive myself, not even myself, not others, and believing that we stand on moral ground. Those who believe in their truth, scientists as well as atheists, as well as religionists and social scientists, make it their personal task to make certain no one else is deceived and believes anything other than their own truth. Now, I want you to hear this. Truth and belief in truth is a belief in that truth being true. It doesn't matter who a person is or what they believe to be their truth to be. The issue is when anyone takes their truth and takes as their truth the right to keep anyone else from believing something else to be true. Listen to that. Jesus Christ said, "My kingdom is not of this world." He did not launch a crusade. He never uses that word. That is a Western word using the cross to attack others and convert others to their faith. Well, what are Christians supposed to do? Jesus told us that the kingdom of God is like the man who sowed his wheat in the field. He sowed his truth out there in the marketplace, out there in the world, that it might spring up and begin to be life in people. And while he slept, while the truth holders slept, the enemy came and began sowing the seeds of the weeds. Sowed the seeds of believing something else back in kindergarten, back in the first grade, back in the second grade. Planted a different truth. And suddenly someone sounds the alarm and comes in and says, "Master, the enemy has come and has now indoctrinated and sown all kinds of weeds in your field. Do you want us to go and start plucking them all up?" And the master said, "No. Let them grow. Let the wheat and let the weeds grow. And in the day of harvest, they will be separated then." In the day of harvest, the master of the field, whose wheat it is, will separate the wheat from the tares, the sheep from the goats. In the meantime, you will destroy the good in the name of attacking the bad. Let them alone. Let them grow. Let me just be totally clear on this. You cannot have Protestants attacking Catholics and vice versa in the name of their truth. We cannot be attacking Western Christianity versus Eastern Christianity in the name of our truth. We cannot have conservative attacking liberal in the name of our truth. Christianity versus LGBTQ in the name of our truth. My kingdom is not of this world. We live in the world, but we are not of the world. How ironic it is, the very science today that protest religion and the forced conversions of others by Western Christianity in particular, by pointing to the Spanish Inquisition and to the humiliation of Galileo being forced to believe in an older scientific version of the universe instead of the newest scientific version. How ironic that that very science today, in the name of its scientific truth, now forces the world to confess today's scientific version of truth at the expense requiring everyone else to renounce their own versions of truth, whether they're scientific or otherwise. The battle in the world is a battle over truth. Whose truth is truth? Nietzsche is a scientist thinking about science, thinking about science belief. It is the truth. and its moral claim to eradicate all belief in a false truth that is contrary to truth. He says you will have gathered that I am what I am driving at, namely that science is still a metaphysical faith upon which our faith in science rests. That even we non-religious seekers after knowledge today, we godless anti-metaphysicians still take our fire also from the flame lit by a faith that is thousands of years old, that Christian faith, which was also the faith of Plato, that God is the truth, that truth is divine. Then in full intellectual honesty and in full existential despair, Nietzsche considers the opposite. What if there is no truth? What if there is nothing which is absolute to be believed? What if this should become more and more incredible? If nothing should ever prove to be divine anymore, unless it is error, mistake, that nothing was eternally and absolutely true, and that the only thing that is true is that everything is a lie. What if truth, everything we believe to be absolute, whether it be God, the divine, or our political truth, our social truth, or our scientific truth, should prove to be our most enduring lie? Nietzsche has correctly envisioned the ultimate end of mankind's belief that reality is limited to an empirical universe. If the visible is all there is, from where does the order within the universe derive? Where does the repetitive order of sunrise and sunset come from? Where derives the order within living things, the seasonal rebirth of vegetation? Where derives the order of living things, the order within ants to be communities or bees, or among herds of animals and flocks of birds? And most of all, in the case of humans, where derives disorder instead of order among humans? Within its empirical box, Nietzsche asked, what does science really know in advance of the character of existence to decide whether it is better to believe or not to believe in anything? Okay, to put a human face to this conversation, consider the following comments by Robert Anton Wilson. Most people, even the educated, think that everybody must believe something or other, that if one is not a theist, one must be a dogmatic atheist. If one does not think capitalism is perfect, one must believe fervently in socialism. And if one does not have blind faith in X, one must alternatively have blind faith in not X, or the reverse of X. My own opinion is that belief is the death of intelligence. Well, let me say, kind of tongue-in-cheek, I believe Robert Anton Wilson believed what he said when he said, I do not believe anything. He believes that he does not believe anything. This is the same contradiction Nietzsche speaks of in our conversation above. Anti-metaphysicians that only believe in scientific truth, by believing that scientific truth exists, have made a scientific statement into a scientific truth that turns science into a scientific faith that worships at the same altar at which all faiths, religious and non-religious, worship, the altar of truth. And so we are back to Pilate's question, what is truth? Asked to the one standing before him who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nietzsche stared into the apocalyptic darkness and dared to ask, what if there is no truth? What if every version of truth, including his own faith in scientific truth, was a lie? Without the faith that something is true, nothing is true. There is nothing to be held onto and kept. Nothing sacred, nothing holy or divine, nothing true. Not history, not precedents, not experiential wisdom regarding using synthetic oil in machinery in sub-zero weather, no self-evident truths in declarations of independence or constitutional or legal truths, no keeping of customs and no traditions. Without truth, there are only the whims of the moment, the chaotic tyranny of a valueless present, inventing its truth on the fly, the flavor of the month truth, the new truth of the moment that plunged France into the apocalyptic reign of terror and Germany into the Nazi Holocaust. Nietzsche's madman saw the death of God in Western culture. It was not the death, ontological death, that drove him mad. He peered into the darkness and beheld the apocalyptic end, the death of truth itself, the chaotic insanity, the anarchy, the being left at the mercy of the mob. When believing dies, believing in the truth dies. When believing in the truth dies, rational thinking dies as well. Rational thinking without believing in truth is impossible. A world of apocalyptic insanity ensues. This is the insanity that drove the madman insane. This is the ultimate apocalyptic end of humanity. A world without God, a world without truth, a world without reason. For the land that I will show you, Abraham believed God. Abraham believed God. He did more than believe in a God. He believed this invisible one telling him to go to the land that he would show him. It is by believing with his feet that Abraham believed with his life. The land of promise is reality as a single whole. It is a single whole of only visible empirical dots that somehow have eternally existed, or it is a single whole in which visible empirical dots that were created by the invisible, existing invisibly and equally present among the visible dots he created. To enter the land that God showed Abraham was to step out of the visible dots into the invisible presence among daily visible reality. God then showed Abraham how to live among the dots. Abraham went out, not knowing where he was going, and dwelt in the land of promise as a foreign country. The land of promise is a foreign land. It contains both the visible dots and the invisible presence of the one among the dots, the invisible one who created the dots. Abraham lived in tents, as did his heirs of the same promise. Abraham believed God, and it was accounted unto him for righteousness, that he might be the father of all those who believe. It is not the children of the flesh that are the heirs. The children of the flesh are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted as the seed. The children of the promise are the heirs of Abraham. They live in the foreign land of promise. Like Abraham, we also live in tents. That is, we do not dwell in that singular world of the invisible empirical dots only. We do not live in that solid house, that solid city, believing only the empirical dots exist and exist eternally. We do not believe that. We live in tents. That is, we live